All right, we are moving through our study of Genesis chapter 1, looking at verses 3 through 5. Now we're moving from the creation of a lifeless darkness into the formation of light and life. God is beginning to form the elements of creation necessary for life to exist and thrive. Now, in this section, we're going to see three sort of subsections. In verse 3, we see God said. Verse 4, we see God saw and separated. And verse 5, we see God specified. Let's go ahead and read verses 3 through 5 now. Then God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. God saw that the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness. God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. Evening came, and then morning, one day. Now, verse 3, we see first that God said, "Let there be light," and there was light. Now, the way God created was not by using his hands or tools. It was simply by speaking, and then what he spoke became a reality. And in this instance, light just comes into the newly created universe simply because God commands it. Now, what's interesting about this light was it wasn't created. God didn't create the light. He said, "Let there be," and it was there. It was just there. It was there and it was brought into this new creation. There's no source of light other than God's light. And this is similar to the light we see at the end of the Bible, in the last chapter of the Bible, in Revelation 22, verse 5. And this light, his light, is now being allowed to shine into his new creation where it did not reside before. And what we see here, even with this, even with his own glory, nothing exists in this new universe without God decreeing it. This light, like all of creation, submits to God's authority. He speaks and creation obeys. We see the power of God's words to bring order and life to a dark and empty earth. All right, in verse 4, we see our next section where God saw and separated. He saw that the light was good and separated it from the darkness. God recognizes this distinction between light and darkness. The light is good, and it is part of the formation of the earth. It is added to the earth to give it life. Darkness, on the other side, is not good. It is the void and emptiness that God is filling and replacing. Now, there's possible moral distinctions here illustrated by light and darkness, but it's a bit of assumption that we're not going to really get into. But what we see is that God continues to make distinctions, both natural and spiritual, separating and defining things, setting the boundaries of his new creation, which is his right as creator. And you see, these boundaries, they bring and keep order to the newly formed earth. We see he separates the waters above from the waters below. This gives space to live. We see the two great lights he separates. We see the male and female distinctions that he makes. And then later, we're going to see how he separates good and evil. We see how it separates his people from not his people, right? Believers from non-believers. He sets these boundaries. He sees and he separates. Now, in verse 5, we're going to see another boundary. We're going to see God here, he specified or defined what is a day. Now, the first day of creation, what's interesting here is it's not necessarily said to be the first day, but one day in the original language. God here, he is defining a day as having day and night and evening and morning, which is because God said it. And then it will later become visible when the sun is created, and the sun and the earth will operate in a way within these boundaries that God has already set. And so it is with this day that God uses to describe the length of time of his creating, 6 days. Now, this is a very important concept or theological principle for me, because what we see, number one, in the text and in the audience's understanding of what the word yom or day is that it speaks to a literal 6 days. Now, modern science says that there's potentially, millions of years, that these are not literal days, but I think that's kind of an influence of inconsistent modern science. You see, a literal 6 days of creation should show God's power in a great way. I mean, he created the entire universe just by speaking and in 6 days. So believing in a young earth or a 6-day creation, for me, just gives God more glory. And so I think it should be more of the default position for us as believers. It's not a primary theological position, so you can believe either young earth or old earth and still be okay. But what is interesting here is that God is defining this day not simply for understanding of creation, but for us. You see, God has wisely and lovingly given and revealed to us a boundary specifically to govern our lives. There are 24 hours in a day, 7 days in a week, and then we have been designed to operate within this boundary. We live and we work during the day and we rest during the night. We work for 6 days and we rest on the seventh day. These are boundaries that God has given us and built and designed us within which to operate. Now, we may disagree with this boundary. We may want more time to get more done. We may put too much on our plates that we can't actually get done within these boundaries. But the problem is that when we try to violate this boundary, we burn out, right? We exhaust ourselves to death. We're trying to push beyond the boundary that God has set for us. Now, the point is that God is setting these boundaries to create life. Therefore, life thrives where there is God-designed order. Let me repeat that. Life thrives where there is God-designed order. For example, we see the natural order, right? Where God's boundaries in nature remain distinct and separated. Living in Florida, the beach is fun, where the boundary of the sea and the land remains. But when there's a hurricane and there's a huge storm surge, this boundary is violated and the sea comes on the land and creates destruction and death. Life thrives where the natural boundaries remain. But there's also spiritual order when God's design for our life is followed and obeyed. For example, marriage God's way, right? When we live and we have relationships and we get married and we do it the way God says it, there is joy, there is love, there is satisfaction, there is life. People in marriage thrive. It is a gift. But when we violate God's boundaries and we do marriage man's way, where we live for self, there's strife, there is guilt, there is shame, and then there is even death or divorce because of that. You see, the issue is that humans, we choose to follow or reject God's boundaries, to either sin or not sin. And the violation of these boundaries, which is sin, can cause disorder and death in God's ordered creation in our lives. When we ignore God's designed separations, we bring chaos and death. There's fear, there's suffering, and there is eventually physical and spiritual death. So the application here is this. We need to learn to live and operate within the boundaries or the limits God has set. You see, we can be prideful and think we can set our own boundaries by which to live, whether it's time boundaries, whether it's relationship boundaries, whether it's physical or mental boundaries, whether it's skills or strengths or intelligence. We try to do things we can't do. We can push boundaries we're not meant to push. We can lose balance in our lives, destroying God's created order and bringing chaos. You see, it is okay to push ourselves and grow, but we need to know what our limits are, what boundaries God has given us, so that we don't try to push through or violate those boundaries. You see, if we want order in our lives rather than chaos, if we want life rather than death, light rather than darkness, we need to learn what these unpushable limits are that God has set. We need to be okay with having limits. Be humble and be submissive to God by operating within those limits. So let me encourage you. Live within God's boundaries. Live within His limits. Don't push yourself too far or too hard to where you're violating those limits and you're bringing that fear and that exhaustion and that death into your life.